So, if I were to pick the primary reason that has blinded people to the truth about Israel, it would definitely be replacement theology. What's replacement theology? Replacement. It means something has been put in its place instead. Although the Jews were chosen by God as his people, as a nation of priests, they have been set aside, and in their place, the church, specifically the Gentile church, the Gentiles, have been seated in that position. So here is an explanation of replacement theology. Shall we read it together? Replacement theology is the view that because the chosen people, Israel, killed Jesus, they have been rejected. This replacement theology ultimately led to the idea that the church has replaced Israel and that the Mosaic covenant has been replaced by the new covenant. Yes, that's what it is. It was during the time of Emperor Constantine that this replacement theology really began to take shape and move forward as what we now call replacement theology. You all remember, right? Emperor Constantine declared Christianity as the state religion. Constantine originally worshipped the sun god and other deities. But when he made Christianity the state religion, he used it for political purposes. So he completely removed all Jewish elements from Christianity. He made sure to exclude anything that was Jewish, and in other words, he removed all elements that had anything to do with Judaism, making Christianity into a new religion. So during his speech at the Council of Nicaea, Constantine made several anti-Semitic proclamations. Let's look at what he said. We must not have anything in common with the Jews. We must separate ourselves from the detestable Jews. It is your duty not to pollute your souls by communicating with such evil people. Emperor Constantine made these statements at the Council of Nicaea. He went on to say that the Jews are a truly wicked people, filthy and detestable, and therefore we must completely eliminate all Jewish elements. We must not share any common elements with the Jews. That is what he insisted. The early Christian church actually had retained many Jewish elements, so there had been a certain connection. But in the end, all of those things were removed. And at the Second Council of Nicaea, it was stated that Christian Jews must completely abandon their Jewish customs. For example, if someone said, I am a Christian, but I do not eat pork, and tried to observe kosher laws, then those people were rejected. They were told, you're not a Christian. They were rejected. They began to reject the idea that you could believe in Jesus while maintaining any Jewish elements. So at that time, in order to prove that they were truly Christians who had accepted Jesus, they had to eat pork in front of witnesses. By publicly consuming it, they had to demonstrate that their conversion was genuine and that they were indeed Christians. This was how they gained recognition as Christians. Such extreme measures began to take root following the Second Council of Nicaea. Then, in 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, it was decreed that all Jews must wear a Jewish badge. And they were also forced to wear specific clothing that only Jews wore. You know, the kind of clothing that comes to mind when you think of Jews, right? The clothing with vertical stripes. That became a symbol representing Jews. In fact, just last year or so, a famous designer in Europe, perhaps in Italy, released a collection featuring striped patterns that strongly evoked the image of Jewish history. In the midst of rising anti-Semitism, this caused a huge public outcry. People were outraged by the design, and under intense global pressure, the brand was forced to withdraw the items and cancel the release entirely. The international community condemned it so strongly that they had to pull the product from the market immediately. Anyway, it was during the Lateran Council that measures like these began. Jews were forced to wear Jewish badges, to dress in distinct clothing to distinguish them, and to live only in designated areas where they were required to reside together. These kinds of actions started at that time. So, as these kinds of things began to happen under Emperor Constantine and the Roman emperors, Figures like Eusebius and Augustine started to establish theological justifications for them. And during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, in the early days of the Christian church, most of the early church fathers living around the 300s were scholars trained in Hellenistic philosophy. Because of that, when these people interpreted the Bible, they began to do so based on Hellenistic philosophy, applying philosophical interpretations. Even when the Bible should have been interpreted literally, they began to interpret it allegorically and symbolically. That laid the groundwork for replacement theology. However, we must remember that the Bible must be understood through the lens of Hebraism, the very foundation upon which it was written. Not Hellenism, but Hebraism. The Bible must be interpreted and biblical thinking must be based on that Hebrew foundation. Hellenism, for example, is very complex, analytical, and deconstructive. It is highly conceptual, and these are the characteristics of Hellenism. However, Hebraism, the biblical perspective, is integrative. It integrates, is action-oriented, and involves doing. They are said to be a people of action. The Hebrews are action-oriented and very simple. When we read the Bible, we shouldn't interpret it based on Hellenistic foundations or conceptual interpretations, but rather we should be able to interpret it from a Hebraic perspective. So theology and biblical interpretation based on this kind of replacement theology have developed. And after the Reformation, the Reformed churches simply inherited the flow of replacement theology that had been formed and maintained by the Catholic Church. So to this day, the influence of this replacement theology has deeply permeated. And because Christians and ordinary believers have come up within that theological atmosphere and under such teachings, it has become natural for us to interpret Israel in the Bible as referring to ourselves, the church, or us. Consequently, as a result of this perspective, we have ended up completely disregarding the specific national calling God has for Israel, along with the messages and unique missions He has entrusted to them. However, as we all know, on May 14, 1948, the nation of Israel actually re-emerged in world history. And remarkably, just 1 year before this independence, God revealed to the whole world the Dead Sea Scrolls, which had been kept hidden for so long from the Qumran caves. This shows that it is God who sovereignly governs history. It was God's work to make this scroll discoverable. It was God's work to keep it from being discovered for 2,000 years. And it was God's work that this was unearthed a year before independence. Everything happens under God's sovereignty and within God's providence. Amen. Up until then, interpretations had been rooted in replacement theology. But now that the nation of Israel actually existed, biblical scholars were faced with a serious dilemma. How should we view the Israel that exists today in relation to the Israel of the Bible? How do we connect the two? How do I connect it? This is a concern that now arises among biblical theologians. This became a new and urgent task for scholars. It served as a turning point, prompting them to re-examine the scriptures from a fresh perspective and to attempt a reinterpretation of Israel as it appears in the Bible. In the 18th century, there was the Moravian community. They were an incredibly devout community that kept prayer going continuously for over 100 years, making sure that prayer never ceased, praying 24 hours a day without interruption for more than a century. The leader of the Moravian community, Count Zinzendorf, and the Moravians recognized Israel's unique calling and mission. Among their constant 24-hour prayers, they specifically interceded for Israel. The first prayer topic they had was, "May Israel be reconstructed as a nation." They prayed for that. Second, they prayed, "May the people of Israel return to Yeshua." And third, they prayed for them to return to their ancestral homeland. They prayed for these three things: that Israel would be rebuilt as a nation, that they would return to Jesus, and that they would return to their ancient land, the Promised Land, which is the land of Palestine today. And incredibly, 200 years later, their prayers were actually answered. Through those who pray, God is the one who works in partnership with us. He wants to carry out his works together with our prayers. So to pray with a heart aligned with God's heart, sharing his concerns and praying together with that heart is a privilege. It is a privilege, a grace enjoyed by these special people. I hope we can all enjoy that privilege. And along with the Moravian community and Count Zinzendorf, there was also the Welsh revival. You know it, right? It was world famous. The key figures who led the Welsh revival, as well as the great man of intercession, Rhys Howells, and also very famous 20th century theologians like Louis Berkhof, John Piper, Karl Barth, and Martin Lloyd-Jones, all these prominent and renowned theologians commonly spoke of one thing, that Israel will experience a great conversion before the second coming of Jesus. There is evidence from many other theologians as well, but since we need to keep it brief, I'll leave it at that. In conclusion, many highly respected theologians have acknowledged the calling of Israel, recognized that replacement theology is mistaken, and affirmed that Israel will surely return to the Lord before Jesus comes again. In 2013, there was a gathering of evangelicals in the United States, and the renowned theologian Dr. Walter Kaiser made the following statement. Let's read it together. We have misunderstood and mistaught Israel. Israel is important not only in the past and the future, but in the present as well. Another theologian, Dr. Barry Horner, made this statement. Theological research throughout church history has been in error. The Bible was written with a focus on the Jewish people, and it is impossible to discuss it without including them. So, as Israel emerged as an actual nation, leading to a fresh reinterpretation and a new perspective on the Bible, there was something that theologians collectively had no choice but to acknowledge and realize. They had been looking at the Jewish people through a flawed theology, replacement theology, and had been interpreting the scriptures incorrectly all along. You know, scholars are people with very strong pride. And even though these scholars have written commentaries, taught for many years, and even trained students in seminaries, to say that their teachings have been wrong all this time, that is a confession that requires immense honesty, the kind of honesty only God can pour out, and yet they have made such confessions. So now, think about Ruth. Ruth was a Gentile woman, a Moabite. It's not like she just pushed Boaz aside, saying, "Hey, get out of the way," to take his place. Instead, Ruth entered into Boaz's life and was brought into that family of the covenant, into the covenant of faith. That is exactly what the Apostle Paul is saying in the book of Romans. He tells us that while you were once strangers to the promise, you have now been brought inside, right into the covenant itself. And originally the Jews were the natural branches of the olive tree, but some of those branches were broken off, and you who were wild olive branches have now been grafted into the true olive tree. That's how it's described, right? Exactly. You who were wild olive branches have been grafted in so well, so how much more easily will the original branches be grafted back in? Paul talks about this in Romans. We need to be able to see Israel, the Jewish people, from that perspective. So what we're saying is that we should acknowledge our Jewish roots. And when we recognize Israel's calling, we can see how God is even now working out what has been written in Scripture. If you hold a theological viewpoint or perspective that completely excludes or sets aside the nation of Israel from the promise of salvation, then you will find yourself unable to truly perceive or understand what exactly God is doing in the world in this very moment of history. You simply won't be able to see it. But when this perspective on Israel begins to take hold in us, and it's as if the scales fall from our eyes, we begin to see clearly what God is doing right now. And then we can clearly understand which prophetic generation we are currently living in, the direction God is heading toward, and the underlying reasons why He is doing these things right now. That's why it's important for us to learn about these things. Learning is very important. That's what Jesus said, isn't it? In the Gospels, Jesus talks about the end times, saying that the king entrusted his servants and left and asks, Who is the one who will give the proper food at the proper time? He says that such a servant is blessed. Jesus said that, right? The timely word. You need to listen to that word. Only then can you see what God is doing, the work of God in this era. So, the completion of redemption is the union of the Jewish church and the Gentile church. This is the final completion of God's redemptive history, and making those two into one new person is God's goal. When the Christ returns and we, all the saints, are gathered together as the bride of Jesus Christ, there will be people from every nation. And among all those nations, the Jewish people are included as well. And so, wouldn't you say that God has a special heart for the Jewish people whom He chose in order to bring salvation to the whole world? It's more than just saying, you too should be saved. Wouldn't it be something deeper than that? That kind of heart is in the heart of God.